Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, so you've sent us a really interesting collection of sources this time, all focused on what history calls its most, well, badass weapons. We're going to step aside from the usual strategy focus today and really look at the hardware, the actual instruments of war that fundamentally shifted things.
That's right. And it's important to understand how these sources are defining badass here. Because if it was just about, the biggest explosion...
You have a pretty short list.
Exactly, a very short conversation. But these sources, they're looking at it through, three lenses. Deadly effectiveness, sure, but also real technological innovation or achieving that kind of legendary status.
Yeah.
Something that goes beyond just being a tool.
I like that layered approach. It gives us more to chew on. So for you listening, we're going to take a bit of a reverse journey through time, starting with the modern era shifters and then working back through medieval times to some really unique ancient and classical examples.
Yeah, the idea is to figure out not just what they were, but why they really mattered, why they left such a mark.
Okay, so where do we start? If we're talking era defining, it has to be the ultimate game changer, right?
We have to begin there. The absolute peak of human destructive power. The invention that, basically reshaped global politics overnight. The nuclear bomb.
Yeah, it really stands alone, doesn't it? As that ultimate technological shockwave, its status is... well, it's completely undisputed.
Absolutely. There's nothing else like it. The single most devastating weapon ever created, capable of just wiping entire cities off the map. But the thing that really gives it that lasting terror, I think, is the radiation. The long-term effects. It's a weapon that continues to kill, makes land unusable for, generations sometimes.
The psychological scar tissue is immense, even beyond the physical destruction.
Unmatched, yeah. It defined the Cold War. It defined the latter half of the 20th century.
Okay, so that's the ultimate endpoint, in a way. Let's jump back before that to the weapon that really kicked off the industrial age of warfare, the Maxim machine gun.
Ah, yes. The Maxim.
This wasn't just a slightly faster gun. It feels like a completely different concept that just broke everything that came before it.
It really did. And what's so fascinating, I find, is how it didn't just, kill more efficiently. It completely flipped the script on battlefield tactics.
Right.
We always hear the stat fired over 500 rounds a minute, late 19th century, which is incredible. Yeah. But the real impact, that density of fire made traditional infantry charges, cavalry assaults, all those Napoleonic maneuvers, basically suicidal, instantly obsolete.
It created the stalemate. The trenches.
Exactly. It's that paradox you mentioned.
Wow.
A weapon built for high-speed killing that paradoxically ground warfare down to this horrific static crawl.
The industrial slaughterhouse, as you put it.
That's what it was. It enforced trench warfare. World War I is the tragic proof on every single front. You simply couldn't charge across open ground anymore.
You had to invent tanks, creeping barrages.
New tactics, yeah. Just to survive crossing no man's land because of this one invention. A massive technological barrier.
So if the Maxim gun kind of ended 19th century tactics, let's go back further to the tech that really ended the medieval world itself. The cannon, early artillery.
Right, the cannon. Its impact wasn't about rate of fire, not like the Maxim gun. It was about the sheer pulverizing force of each shot.
Against stone walls.
Precisely.
Right.
It effectively ended the age of the castle. For centuries, military defense was all about thick stone walls, high towers. Suddenly you get enough gunpowder packed behind a big enough iron ball, and those walls just crumbled.
And that wasn't just a military change, was it? There were huge political ripple effects, too.
Oh, absolutely revolutionary. Because fielding effective cannon, especially siege artillery, was incredibly expensive. Your average local feudal lord, they just couldn't afford to build or defend against them anymore.
So power concentrates upwards.
Exactly. The sources really emphasize this. Cannons have centralized military power into the hands of kings, wealthy states who could afford professional armies and these new expensive weapons.
You mentioned Constantinople earlier.
The Siege of Constantinople, 1453. It's the classic textbook example. Ottoman cannons just pounding those ancient Theodosian walls that had stood for 1,000 years, into rubble. Rendered traditional defenses totally obsolete. A real turning point.
Okay, so we've hit these big technological leaps, industrial scale, gunpowder scale. But if we go further back into the ancient world, the idea of badass seems to shift, doesn't it? Less about mass production, maybe more about ingenuity, specialized function.
I think that's a great way to put it. The ancient and classical periods, they give us these unique wonders. Weapons that often relied on cleverness, surprise, maybe compensating for not having gunpowder or mass production.
And I think the one that always jumps out, the most terrifying example of that kind of ingenuity, has to be Greek fire. The psychological impact alone.
Oh, absolutely crippling. It was the Byzantine Empire's secret weapon for centuries, mainly used at sea. We still don't know the exact formula, which adds to the mystique, right?
Yeah.
But we know it was this sticky, incendiary liquid. And the key thing, it burned on water.
Just imagine that. You're on a wooden ship, they spray this stuff, and throwing water on it makes it worse.
The terror must have been immense. It gave the Byzantines a huge strategic edge, especially defending Constantinople in naval battles for a very long time. Pure psychological warfare mixed with, well, some kind of chemical genius.
That's asymmetrical warfare at its most visceral. And speaking of defensive genius, staying in that vein, we have Archimedes' claw.
Ah, the claw of Syracuse.
We often think offensively, but this was pure defensive brilliance, wasn't it? Turning an attack back on itself.
Pure mechanical ingenuity. When the Romans were besieging Syracuse, Archimedes reportedly deployed this. Well, it was like a giant crane with a massive grappling hook.
Right.
It would reach out over the city walls, grab onto the attacking Roman ships, lift them partly out of the water, shake them violently, and then drop them or capsize them.
Incredible. Not killing directly, but neutralizing the threat in a really dramatic way.
Totally manipulating the battlefield. It's a fantastic example of intellect potentially trumping sheer numbers or conventional force, using physics as a weapon.
But it's not always about the physical device itself. Sometimes the weapon is the unit, the training, the doctrine. Our sources point to the Hypaspis from Macedon.
Yes, Alexander the Great's elite infantry. The Hypaspis were fascinating because their strength was versatility. You had the main Macedonian force, the phalanx, with their super long pikes, very powerful, but also kind of inflexible.
Right, needed flat ground.
Exactly. The Hypaspis, though, they carried maybe shorter spears or javelins, swords, better shields. They could operate on rough terrain, protect the flanks of the phalanx, act as shock troops. They were like the special forces bridging the gap.
So their badass quality came from adaptability and training, making their standard kit deadly in context.
Precisely. Doctrine and training amplifying the hardware.
Okay, sticking with specific kit then, but unique designs. We have to mention the khopesh, that ancient Egyptian sword.
The khopesh.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful example of functional design meeting cultural weight. That sickle shape, it wasn't just ceremonial.
No. What was the function?
Well, accounts suggest it could be used to hook an enemy's shield, pull it aside, or even potentially trip them up by hooking behind the leg or arm. It combined chopping power, like an axe, with this unique hooking ability.
Wow.
And yes, it was also a symbol of pharaonic authority, often shown in artwork. So it was prestigious and brutally effective in close combat. Shows that innovation isn't always about new material. Sometimes it's just geometry.
Okay, let's move forward a bit, into the medieval period. Here we see a shift again, maybe towards countering armor, extending range, and the absolute icon of ranged medieval warfare has to be the English longbow.
The longbow, yeah, it dominated European battlefields for a significant period, and for good reason. It's a really interesting contrast to the machine gun we talked about earlier.
How so?
Well, it was the great individual equalizer of its time, maybe the 14th, 15th centuries. Highly skilled archers could shoot incredibly rapidly, volume fire with heavy arrows.
Arrows that could pierce plate armor at considerable range.
Exactly. That capability, punching through the best armor available, was previously something only, a wealthy knight with a lance on horseback might reliably do. Suddenly, a commoner with enough training could bring down a knight from afar.
But that training was key, wasn't it? It wasn't a simple weapon to use effectively.
Absolutely not. That's its strategic significance. It required immense strength and years of practice. English kings even mandated practice by law. It wasn't just a piece of wood, it was a national military system.
Right.
Its true badass status comes from that combination of battlefield effect, increasing Agincourt, and the societal effort needed to field it effectively. It was about massed volleys, area denial, creating that arrow storm.
So if the longbow owned the ranged space, what about up close? The sources mention the Norman sword as a key medieval melee weapon. What makes that sword stand out as particularly badass? It seems fairly standard.
It does seem simple, especially compared to something like the khopesh, yeah. But its significance is maybe more symbolic and tied to a specific historical impact. The Norman sword, that broad, double-edged, fairly straightforward design, was the weapon wielded by the conquerors at Hastings in 1066.
Ah, okay. The tool of conquest.
Exactly. It became the symbol of the new Norman ruling class in England. So while technologically it might seem basic, it's an icon of a major military and social upheaval. It represents the imposition of power. Sometimes a weapon's status comes from who wielded it and what they achieved with it.
That makes sense. And then towards the end of the medieval period, we see that disruptive force gunpowder coming back, but this time in the hands of individual soldiers.
Right. This is where things start to shift again. We get early hand cannons, arquebuses, but also importantly, the widespread adoption of the crossbow becomes really significant too.
Why the crossbow alongside early firearms?
Because both, in different ways, dramatically lowered the barrier to entry for projectile lethality compared to the longbow. A crossbowman could be trained much, much faster than a longbowman.
Right. Less strength required, easier skill to pick up.
Exactly. And early firearms, while slow and inaccurate, offered armor penetration without needing years of dedicated physical training. You could potentially give a peasant a crossbow or an early firearm, and with relatively little training, they posed a real threat to that knight in shining armor who'd trained his whole life.
Another equalizer then, shifting the balance again.
Yes. They introduced new dynamics, range and firepower starting to trump inherited status and lifelong martial skill. You see the beginnings of the trends that would eventually lead to the Maxim gun, in a way.
Okay, wow. We've really covered a huge range here, from, a giant claw that sinks ships to city vaporizing bombs, unique swords, dominant bows. So let's try to synthesize this. What's the common thread? What really elevates a weapon to this badass status, gives it that historical reverence?
Well, looking across all these examples, the sources seem to point towards maybe two main driving forces that often seem to be in tension, or at least in dialogue with each other.
Okay.
First, there's undeniable game-changing technological innovation. The weapon that just makes everything before it look inadequate, suddenly obsolete.
Like the cannon making castle walls obsolete, or the Maxim gun changing infantry tactics.
Precisely. That sheer leap forward in capability that forces everyone to adapt or perish. That's one path to legendary status.
And the second force? The one that explains maybe the Khopesh or the Norman sword, or even legendary, possibly mythical weapons like Excalibur.
That's the other side. Mythic or cultural significance. This is about the power the weapon holds in the human mind, in the story we tell about it.
So less about what it physically does, more about what it represents.
Exactly. Think about legendary swords. Whether Excalibur was real or not is almost irrelevant. Its power in the narrative, the symbol of rightful kingship, that's its significance. It's revered not necessarily because it cuts better steel, but because of the meaning invested in it by the culture.
That distinction is really interesting, the physical versus the symbolic or psychological damage.
Yeah.
Do you think sometimes the psychological impact actually outweighs the body count?
Oh, I think absolutely. We really have to factor in the power of fear, the power of the mind. Some weapons seem almost designed primarily for psychological impact.
Like what?
Well, the sources mention things like early forms of biological warfare, catapulting diseased corpses into besieged cities. The actual number killed by the disease might be secondary to the sheer terror and panic it caused, the breakdown of morale.
Right, or even things like shock cavalry charges in history.
Yes. Tactics designed to shatter the enemy's will to fight, to make them break and run before the real killing even started. In those cases, the terror is the primary weapon. Greek fire fits here too, that inextinguishable aspect.
So looking back, the definition of most badass really does shift with the times, doesn't it? From maybe relying on one moment of pure inventive genius in ancient times to needing massive industrial backing in the modern era.
It does. But the common thread, I think, is disruption. Every single weapon we've talked about fundamentally disrupted how people fought, how they defended themselves, maybe even how they structured their societies. They changed the rules.
It's quite a journey through human, ingenuity. Sometimes terrifying ingenuity. From a simple, specialized blade to weapons of unimaginable complexity and destruction.
Each one an answer, in its own way, to the strategic challenges of its time.
Okay, so now we want to turn it over to you, the listener. As you think about this spectrum we've covered from, say, the symbolism of a sword to the clever mechanics of the claw, right up to the world-altering power of the nuclear bomb, here's something to ponder.
Yeah, when we measure a weapon's true historical power, its legacy, What ultimately dictates its place? Is it the psychological impact, that deep-seated fear, the mythic status, the cultural weight? Or is it the raw, undeniable technological innovation that just changes the physical reality of conflict?
The terror of Greek fire versus the mechanics of the Maxim gun, perhaps.
Exactly. That dual nature, the power in the mind versus the power in the physics. Which one truly defines a weapon's historical significance? Something for you to think about.
A fascinating question. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into history's most impactful and, yes, badass weapons. We'll catch you next time. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty intense. Using the sources you provided to figure out which weapons have historically caused the most casualties, but specifically within a single conventional battle. It's interesting because when you hear deadliest weapon, I think most of it, well, we picture something specific, right? Like instant, massive destruction. But the data we're looking at forces us to be really precise about the setting. We're talking conventional warfare, troops on a battlefield, that kind of thing.
That definition is absolutely crucial here. You can measure lethality in a couple of ways, really. There's the instantaneous devastating impact, often on civilians.
Right.
Or there's the sustained destruction you see on a traditional military front in a battle. If we just look at sheer, instantaneous power, the conversation's over before it really starts.
Okay, so let's get the big one out of the way then, the one everyone immediately thinks of, nuclear weapons. Why aren't they topping this specific list, the conventional battlefield list?
Well, simply put, they kind of break the definition of a battle as we understand it conventionally. The sources are clear. Single events, like the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, caused, easily over 100,000 deaths each, instantly.
Unbelievable.
Completely unparalleled. But those aren't really battles in the traditional sense. They were catastrophic strikes on cities, not, tactical fights between armies on a specific field. So once we stick to that boundary, conventional battles, only we have to set aside those instant non-conventional game changers. And what's left? It's the tools of sustained, high-volume killing on the battlefield itself.
Got it. So setting aside the atom bomb and focusing on what caused the most carnage in, say, World War I or World War II style engagements, the sources seem to point very strongly at two main things.
They do.
Artillery and the machine gun. A pretty terrifying combination.
It really is. And to grasp their impact, you have to look at the sheer numbers they generated, battle after battle, conflict after conflict. If we're looking for the historical leader in just raw body count in conventional fights, you have to start with the weapon often called the king of the battlefield.
Artillery. Which is maybe counterintuitive. We often picture close combat infantry charges, but you're saying most of the killing actually happened from miles away.
That's exactly right. Artillery's deadliness isn't really about pinpoint accuracy, especially back then. It was about volume. High volume of explosive, shrapnel, sustained fire over a large area.
Area effect.
Precisely. Think of it less like sniping and more like grinding down the enemy position continuously, often without warning. It's brutally efficient at causing mass casualties before soldiers might even hear the incoming round. And historically, its impact is just staggering. The sources confirm, especially in World War I, artillery was responsible for the majority of all casualties, period. Yes. Entire battle plans, trench designs, logistics, so much revolved around simply surviving the constant artillery barrages or trying desperately to knock out the enemy's guns.
Okay, that makes sense for WWI, the trenches and all that. But you mentioned this title, King of the Battlefield. Still resonates. How relevant is artillery's impact today, according to the sources?
It's chillingly relevant. Even now, with all our smart bombs and drones, the data consistently shows that conventional artillery and other general explosive ordnance still account for something like 70 to 75% of all battlefield casualties in modern conventional wars.
70 to 75%. Still.
It remains the biggest killer by percentage on the battlefield, year after year. It's mostly the fragmentation, the shrapnel, not usually the direct hit itself, that causes such widespread trauma.
75%. That statistic it completely changes how you visualize a modern conflict zone. It's not two groups shooting directly at each other necessarily.
Much of the time, it isn't. It's an environment saturated with potential death from unseen distances. And that scale is what separates modern artillery from, say, older cannons.
Right, like siege weapons from medieval times.
Exactly. Those older weapons, huge catapults or early cannons, they definitely cause casualties. So there's lots of them in a siege. But modern artillery, with chemical propellants, better metallurgy, faster reloading, it achieved a rate and intensity of fire a sheer volume of explosive force that was unimaginable before. It's volume times explosive power.
Okay, so artillery is the long-range, area denial, mass casualty generator, the king. But then there's its partner in crime, the machine gun. If artillery is the king ruling from afar, the machine gun sounds like the close-in executioner.
That's a really good way to put it, actually. The machine gun fundamentally changed infantry combat. It almost instantly flipped the tactical advantage to the defender. Before the machine gun, charging across open ground was dangerous. After it, it was often just suicide.
We're talking about weapons like the Maxim gun, right?
Yeah.
The ones that spat out bullets continuously.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. The Maxim, or the German version, the MG08, used heavily in World War I. These weapons took infantry firefights from single, aimed shots to, well, sustained automatic streams of bullets. And the casualty figures that resulted sometimes in a single day are just horrifying.
And this is where the sources give us that one truly gut-wrenching example, the one that defines the machine gun's lethality. The Battle of the Somme.
Ah, the Somme, yes. It's the absolute textbook case for this. In World War I, let's try to picture it. The British and French launched this enormous offensive. They believed a massive week-long artillery bombardment had just obliterated the German defenses, the barbed wire, everything.
But it hadn't had it.
Not nearly enough. The Germans were dug in deep, in concrete bunkers sometimes. So on July 1st, 1916, about 110,000 British soldiers were ordered over the top. They advanced, often slowly, walking in formation across no man's land.
Straight towards the German lines.
Straight towards largely intact German machine gun positions. The sources describe how the German gunners, relatively safe in their positions, just opened fire. And kept firing for hours.
And the result. What were the numbers on just that first day?
It was the single worst day in British military history. On that one day, July 1st, about 21,000 British soldiers were killed outright. Another nearly 36,000 were wounded.
That's over 57,000 casualties in less than 24 hours.
Yes. 57,000. And a huge, undeniable portion of those killed instantly were cut down by machine gun fire as they tried to cross that open ground.
But it wasn't just the machine gun acting alone, was it? It was the combination you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. It was a terrible synergy. The preceding artillery barrage, even if it didn't destroy the defenses, it churned up the ground, maybe forced soldiers into shell holes or inadequate cover.
Made them vulnerable targets.
Exactly. It disrupted everything. And then, the moment they moved, the machine guns were waiting. The artillery created the killing zone, and the machine gun ensured maximal lethality within it. That combination is what drove casualties into the tens of thousands so quickly in battles like the Somme. It perfected mass slaughter in the conventional era.
Before we wrap this up, we should probably quickly mention chemical weapons. They loom so large in the popular imagination of World War I, especially.
Right, a necessary point. Chemical weapons, things like mustard gas, chlorine gas, they were truly horrific, cause immense suffering, terrible injuries, long-term health problems for hundreds of thousands, absolutely terrifying psychologically.
But in terms of sheer numbers killed in battle?
In terms of fatalities specifically, based on the sources we looked at, chemical weapons actually killed fewer soldiers overall in the major conflicts compared to sustained artillery fire or concentrated machine gun use. Their impact was devastating, no question, but more in terms of injury, terror, and the psychological dimension of warfare, rather than topping the list for single battle death tolls.
Okay, so bringing it all together then, if our mission was to find the deadliest conventional weapons in a single battle, based on these sources, what's the final verdict?
The conclusion seems pretty solid based on this data. The highest raw casualty counts in historical conventional battles overwhelmingly belong to artillery and machine guns, often working together. They were the tools that consistently generated the sheer volume of death needed to create mass casualty events, like the first day of the Somme.
It really forces you to redefine deadliest in this context, doesn't it? It's not necessarily the single biggest bang, the non-conventional event, but the reliable, efficient, high-percentage killers. The gun and the shell.
Well, thanks for walking us through that grim but important history.
Absolutely. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If, as the data suggests, 70 to 75% of modern battlefield casualties still come from artillery, bombs, these area effect weapons, how does that focus on distance change what lethality even means strategically going forward?
Our military doctrine still focused on winning the close-end fight, the machine gun fight, when maybe the most decisive killer is actually firing from miles away. It's worth thinking about that difference between, immediate headline-grabbing destruction versus that sustained high-percentage casualty generation over time.